The heavy bag exploded with a sound that shouldn't exist. George Foreman stepped back, staring at his gloves, then at the torn leather hanging like dead skin from the chain. In 47 years of boxing, he'd never seen anything like it. But this wasn't about power. This was about the ghost of a hand technique that haunted him since October 30th, 1974, in the suffocating heat of Kinshasa. If you think you know everything about the greatest upset in boxing history, think again. What you're about to discover will change how you see that legendary fight forever. Hit that notification bell, because this story gets darker with every chapter. The Texas sun blazed mercilessly over Foreman's ranch as he unwrapped his hands, revealing knuckles that told stories of 1,000 battles. At 72, Big George still trained daily, but today something felt different. The way his right hand moved, the subtle rotation he'd unconsciously adopted, triggered a memory he'd buried for decades. "Maria," he called to his wife, his voice carrying across the sprawling property dotted with cattle and memories. "Come look at this." Maria Foreman emerged from the main house, wiping flour from her apron. After 26 years of marriage, she knew that tone. Something had shaken the unshakable George Foreman. "What is it, honey?" George held up his right hand, fingers spread wide. "Watch this." He threw a slow-motion punch into the air, his wrist twisting in a way that defied conventional boxing wisdom. "I've been doing this for months without realizing it. But I know where I learned it." The memory crashed over him like a tidal wave. Zaire, the rumble in the jungle. The night Muhammad Ali broke every rule of physics and boxing logic to become heavyweight champion again. But it wasn't Ali's famous rope-a-dope that haunted George. It was something far more subtle, something he'd only noticed in the 8th round when it was too late. "Tell me," Maria said, settling into the porch swing that had witnessed countless conversations about George's legendary career. George's eyes grew distant, transported back to that sweltering African night when he was the most feared heavyweight on the planet, undefeated in 40 fights, 37 by knockout. Everyone expected him to demolish the aging Ali within 3 rounds. Everyone except Ali himself. It was his hands, Maria, not the way he threw punches, but how he held them, how he moved them. There was something... George paused, struggling to articulate what had taken him nearly 5 decades to understand. Something that made every punch I threw feel like I was hitting water. The revelation had started 3 weeks earlier during a routine training session with young fighters at his gym in Marshall, Texas. George was demonstrating proper defensive techniques when he noticed his hands moving in patterns he didn't remember learning. The subtle shifts, the almost imperceptible rotations, the way his fingers seemed to create invisible barriers in the air. "Show me again," said Marcus, a promising heavyweight from Houston who reminded George of his younger self. "All power, no finesse." George repeated the movement, and this time he felt it. The technique wasn't about blocking punches. It was about redirecting energy, about making an opponent's power work against them. It was pure Ali. "Where'd you learn that, Mr. Foreman?" Marcus asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. That's when it hit him. The night in Zaire, when Ali had done something impossible, something that defied every boxing textbook ever written. Something that had cost George the most important fight of his life. Chapter 1 ends here, but the real mystery is just beginning. Make sure you're subscribed, because what George discovers next will blow your mind. Drop a comment below. Do you think Ali had a secret technique? Let's discuss. The flight to Kinshasa had been a nightmare of humidity and anticipation. George remembered stepping off the plane into air so thick you could taste it, feeling like he was breathing through wet cotton. The temperature hovered around 90 degrees with humidity that made Texas summers feel like Arctic winters, but none of that mattered. He was 25 years old, undefeated, and absolutely convinced he would destroy Muhammad Ali. "Big George is coming to town," The local children would chant as his entourage moved through the dusty streets of Zaire's capital. President Mobutu had turned the fight into a celebration of African pride, and the entire continent seemed to pulse with excitement. But Ali was different in Africa. Not just confident, but mystical. He moved through the crowds like he belonged there, speaking broken French mixed with English, connecting with people in ways that seemed impossible for an American boxer. George watched from his hotel window as Ali jogged through the streets at dawn, his hands moving in strange patterns as he ran. "What's he doing with his hands?" George had asked his trainer, Dick Sadler, pointing down at the street where Ali shadowboxed while jogging. "Probably just showing off," Sadler replied, but his voice carried uncertainty. Now, in his Texas ranch, George understood that Ali hadn't been showing off. He'd been practicing, perfecting a technique that would make the impossible possible. The sparring sessions in Zaire had been brutal affairs. George demolished every partner they brought him, his punches landing with the force of sledgehammers. The local fighters would leave the ring shaking their heads, amazed by the Americans' power. But Ali's training sessions were different, quieter, more focused on movement than impact. George had snuck over to watch Ali train one evening, curiosity getting the better of him. What he saw confused him then, but made perfect sense now. Ali wasn't just throwing punches, he was conducting an orchestra. His hands moved in flowing patterns, creating shapes in the air that seemed to have their own logic. "Angelo," Ali had called to his trainer, Angelo Dundee. "Watch this." Ali threw a combination at the heavy bag, but his hands never quite landed solid. Instead, they seemed to caress the leather, redirecting the bag's movement rather than stopping it. The bag swayed in impossible patterns, moving in ways that defied the laws of physics. George understood. "That's it, champ," Dundee had said, nodding approvingly. "Make the bag work for you, not against you." Back in Texas, George demonstrated the technique to Maria, his movements now more fluid than they'd been in decades. "It's like he was painting with his punches," he explained. "Not trying to destroy the canvas, but create something beautiful on it." The night of the fight, October 30th, 1974, had started exactly as everyone expected. George came out like a hurricane, throwing bombs that would have flattened any other heavyweight in history. But Ali didn't try to avoid them. He absorbed them, redirected them, made them part of his own rhythm. He was using my power against me, George realized, speaking the words aloud for the first time in 47 years. Every punch I threw made him stronger. Now, the technique wasn't visible to the crowd, barely noticeable even to the trained eyes of boxing experts. It was in the microseconds between contact and impact, the way Ali's hands would shift just enough to turn a devastating blow into a glancing touch. The way he would lean into punches while simultaneously deflecting them. By the fourth round, George had felt it. His punches, which had been landing with authority early in the fight, began to feel different, softer, like he was hitting fog instead of flesh and bone. But the crowd saw him connecting, saw Ali against the ropes, and assumed Big George was winning. "I was losing the fight even when I thought I was winning it," George told Maria, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and regret. "Ali was teaching me a lesson I was too young and too arrogant to understand." The eighth round had changed everything. George remembered it with crystal clarity now, every detail sharp as broken glass. He'd thrown his best right hand, a punch that had knocked out 37 men, directly at Ali's chin. In that split second before impact, he'd seen something in Ali's eyes. Not fear, not determination, but something that looked almost like pity. Ali's hands had moved like water, flowing around George's punch in a way that seemed to violate the laws of physics. The power of George's right hand, instead of landing on Ali's jaw, somehow got redirected back into George's own body. He felt his own strength turned against him, his balance compromised by his own force. "It was like punching a mirror," George explained to Maria, his hands trembling slightly as he relived the moment. Everything I threw came back at me twice as hard. The knockdown that followed wasn't just a result of Ali's counterpunch. It was the culmination of 8 rounds of having his own energy systematically redirected back at him. When Ali's right hand finally landed, George was already falling, defeated not by Ali's power, but by his own. "Down goes Foreman! Down goes Foreman!" Howard Cosell's voice had echoed through the humid African night, but George barely heard it. He was too busy trying to understand what had just happened to him. Lying on the canvas in Kinshasa, staring up at the lights and the African sky beyond, George had felt something he'd never experienced before: complete helplessness. Not because he wasn't strong enough or fast enough, but because he'd been outthought, outmaneuvered by a technique he didn't even know existed. "I spent the next 10 years trying to figure out what he did to me," George told Maria. "I studied films, talked to trainers, even tried to contact some of Ali's old sparring partners. Nobody could explain it." The technique, George now realized, wasn't something Ali had learned in a traditional boxing gym. It was older than that, deeper than that. It came from an understanding of energy and movement that transcended sport. Ali had somehow learned to turn boxing into a form of physical poetry, where power was less important than flow. "Remember when you started doing martial arts?" Maria asked, referring to George's brief exploration of Eastern fighting disciplines in the 1980s. "That's when I first got a hint of it," George nodded. "The Tai Chi instructor kept talking about redirecting force instead of meeting it head-on. But I was too stubborn to really listen, too convinced that power was everything." The irony wasn't lost on him. George Foreman, the man who'd built a fortune selling grills that cooked food with direct heat and force, had been defeated by a technique based on the exact opposite principle. Ali had cooked him slowly, gently, using George's own fire against him. "So why are you learning it now?" Maria asked. "After all these years?" George looked at his hands, still powerful despite his age, but now capable of something more subtle than destruction. "Because I finally understand what Ali was trying to teach me that night in Zaire. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about becoming something more than just a fighter." The revelation had practical implications too. George had started incorporating the technique into his training sessions with young fighters, teaching them that true power came not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to redirect. The results were remarkable. Fighters who had relied purely on strength began to develop finesse. Boxers who had been one-dimensional became artists. "Ali knew I'd figure it out eventually," George realized. He planted a seed that night in Zaire, knowing it would take decades to grow. That's why he never held a grudge, why he was always so kind to me after the fight. He knew he'd given me something more valuable than a victory. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March 2021. George was in his study, surrounded by boxing memorabilia and business documents, when his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Foreman, there's someone on the phone who says he has something that belonged to Muhammad Ali. Says it's about the fight in Zaire." George's heart skipped a beat. Ali had passed away 5 years earlier, taking with him the secrets of that legendary night. Or so George had thought. "This is George Foreman," he said into the phone. "Mr. Foreman, my name is Dr. Rashid Hassan. I was Muhammad Ali's personal physician during his later years. Before he passed, he asked me to contact you when the time was right. He said you'd know what that meant." George's hands began to shake. "What do you have?" "A notebook, handwritten by Ali himself. It contains detailed descriptions of the technique he used against you in Zaire. He called it the water method. He wanted you to have it." 3 days later, Dr. Hassan arrived at the ranch carrying a weathered leather notebook. George opened it with trembling fingers, and there, in Ali's distinctive handwriting, were the secrets he'd spent 47 years trying to understand. "The water method is not about fighting," Ali had written. "It is about flowing." Water does not fight the rock, it flows around it. Eventually the rock becomes smooth, shaped by the water's patience. Page after page detailed the technique's principles: how to read an opponent's energy before they threw a punch, how to position your hands to create invisible channels that redirected force, how to use an attacker's aggression as fuel for your own movement. He studied this for years, Dr. Hassan explained. After his suspension from boxing, he traveled to China, studied with masters who taught him that fighting was just one application of much larger principles. He came back to boxing not as a fighter, but as an artist. The notebook contained sketches, diagrams, even philosophical observations about the nature of conflict and resolution. Ali had turned boxing into a metaphor for life itself, using the ring as a laboratory for exploring deeper truths about human nature. "Look at this," George said, pointing to a passage near the end of the notebook. "He wrote this about our fight." Maria read aloud, "George Foreman is the strongest man I ever faced, but strength without wisdom is like a river without banks. In Zaire, I gave him the banks. Someday, he will understand that true power flows from understanding, not force. When he learns this, he will become not just a better fighter, but a better man." George closed the notebook, tears streaming down his face. He knew. Even then, he knew I'd eventually figure it out. The final pages of the notebook contained instructions for teaching the water method to others. Ali had envisioned a new generation of fighters who understood that combat was not about destruction, but about harmony, about finding balance in the midst of chaos. "He wanted you to carry this forward," Dr. Hassan said, "to teach others what he taught you, even if it took 47 years for the lesson to sink in." George looked out at his ranch, at the training facilities where young fighters came to learn the fundamentals of boxing. Tomorrow, he would begin teaching them something far more valuable than how to throw a punch. He would teach them how to flow like water, how to turn an opponent's strength into their own advantage, how to find victory through understanding rather than force. Ali's greatest knockout wasn't in Zaire, George realized, speaking to Maria as Dr. Hassan prepared to leave. It was this moment, right now. He knocked out my ego 47 years ago, and I'm just now hitting the canvas. The water method would live on, passed from teacher to student, from generation to generation. Ali's true legacy wasn't the fights he won or the records he set. It was the wisdom he planted in the hearts of his opponents, seeds that would bloom long after the final bell had rung. As the sun set over the Texas ranch, George Foreman began to practice the movements described in Ali's notebook. His hands moved like water, flowing and redirecting, carrying forward a technique that had traveled from ancient China to modern Africa to the heart of America. The greatest fight of his life was just beginning. This story proves that sometimes the most powerful victories happen decades after the final bell. If this incredible revelation amazed you as much as it did me, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because legends like Ali and Foreman have more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Share this video with every boxing fan you know, because some stories are too incredible to keep to yourself. What other boxing mysteries do you think are hiding in plain sight? Let me know in the comments below.